She offered herself for shelter, but the cowboy told her, "You don't owe me anything." The storm rolled fiercely across the endless plains, drowning the horizon in darkness as thunder rattled the earth beneath her tired feet. The young woman moved slowly along the muddy road, her hair soaked, her clothes clinging tightly to her trembling body. Every step she took was heavy, weighed down not only by exhaustion but by the despair of knowing she had no place to go, no arms waiting for her, no roof to shield her from the cruelty of the night. The wind bit into her skin, and her hands shook as she wrapped them around herself in a futile attempt to stay warm. Just as her legs threatened to give way, her eyes caught the flickering glow of a lantern in the distance, a small light burning against the sea of darkness. It came from a lonely wooden ranch house, standing strong at the edge of an open field. Hope flickered inside her chest, weak but desperate, and she forced herself toward it, dragging her feet through the mud until she reached the porch. With the last of her strength, she raised her hand and knocked gently on the door, praying someone inside would take pity on her. The door opened with a creak, and there stood a tall cowboy, his boots marked with dust, his hat tilted low, and his eyes sharp yet steady. He looked at her without speaking at first, as if trying to read the story behind her worn face. She stammered out a plea, her voice breaking as she explained she had nowhere left to go, no one who would welcome her in. Out of fear and shame, she offered the only thing she thought had value, herself, in exchange for a place to rest. Her words trembled, and her eyes filled with tears as she lowered her head, terrified that he might mock her or turn her away. For a long moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the fire crackling somewhere inside. But the cowboy didn't laugh, and he didn't scorn her. Instead, he stepped aside and told her to come in out of the cold. His voice was deep, steady, and kind, carrying a weight of sincerity she hadn't heard in a long time. He pulled out a chair at his wooden table, set down an extra plate, and poured her a steaming cup of coffee. Then he fetched a warm blanket and placed it gently around her shoulders. She tried once more to explain that she had nothing else to give, that she couldn't stay without paying him back in some way. But he only shook his head, his eyes firm yet soft, and spoke the words that pierced straight through her heart. "You don't owe me anything." She sat in silence, stunned by his kindness. Tears rolled down her face as she realized he expected nothing in return. No bargain, no hidden price. That night, as the storm roared outside, she sat by the fire and felt something she had nearly forgotten: safety, dignity, and compassion. For the cowboy, it wasn't about what he could take from her, but what he could give: a roof, warmth, and respect. And as the flames lit the room, she understood that true humanity still lived in the quiet hearts of strangers who chose kindness when the world offered none. The door opened slowly, and in the frame stood a tall cowboy, his shoulders broad, his boots worn from years of hard work, and his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. His gaze was sharp, but not unkind, steady in a way that made her feel both exposed and strangely safe. For a long moment he didn't say anything, simply studying her as though he could read the story of her suffering in the lines of her face. The silence made her heart pound louder in her chest, and she forced herself to speak even though her voice shook. She explained in broken sentences that she had nowhere else to turn, no family waiting, no one who would take her in. The words felt heavy on her tongue, almost too humiliating to say aloud, but desperation pushed them out. Finally, her trembling lips offered what she thought was the only thing she had left to give: herself, in exchange for a roof over her head. Her eyes dropped to the ground as soon as the words left her mouth, shame flooding her cheeks with heat. She was terrified he might laugh at her, slam the door in her face, or worse, accept her offer with cold indifference. Her voice cracked as she repeated it, her hands twisting together as though wringing out her fear. The sound of the wind outside pressed against the walls of the ranch house, and for a few endless seconds, the only noise between them was the faint crackle of the fire burning somewhere inside. She couldn't bear to lift her head, certain that his silence meant rejection. Yet, instead of turning her away, the cowboy shifted slightly, and his boots creaked against the wooden floor as he stepped aside. His voice, when it finally came, was calm and steady, carrying no judgment, no cruelty, only a quiet firmness that told her she was safe. He told her to come inside out of the cold, to sit down and warm herself by the fire. She lifted her eyes in disbelief, startled by the unexpected kindness. Still, fear lingered in her chest, and she tried again to explain that she couldn't stay without paying him back, that she owed him something. But he shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable except for the sincerity shining through his gaze. With deliberate patience, he repeated the words she never expected to hear. "You don't owe me anything." The sound of those words seemed to break something inside her, not in pain, but in relief, like a heavy chain snapping loose after years of being carried. Her lips trembled, her throat tightened, and tears began to roll down her face as she realized he meant it. He didn't want anything in return, no bargain, no hidden demand. He simply wanted her to be safe. In that moment, standing in the warmth of his home, she felt a piece of her shattered spirit begin to heal. The cowboy didn't hesitate, not even for a moment, and with a calm certainty he stepped aside, opening the door wider to let her in from the raging storm. The warmth of the fire inside wrapped around her the second she crossed the threshold, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt air that didn't sting her skin or bite her bones. His voice was steady and kind when he spoke, the kind of voice that came from someone who had lived long enough to understand suffering but had chosen not to add to it. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand an explanation, and didn't press her for details about where she had come from or what had driven her into the storm. Instead, he moved with a quiet simplicity, setting another plate at the wooden table, pouring her a cup of steaming coffee and sliding it toward her as though she had been expected all along. The scent of roasted beans filled her nose, and though her hands trembled too much to lift the cup at first, the warmth radiating from it felt like life itself. Then, without a word, he fetched a blanket from the back of a chair and gently placed it around her shoulders, tucking it in slightly so the cold couldn't slip back inside. The gesture was so human, so unguarded, that she almost broke down in tears right then. She tried again to insist she couldn't stay unless she found some way to repay him, her voice cracking with both fear and shame, but he simply shook his head slowly. His eyes were calm but firm, his gaze carrying a strength that left no room for argument, and when he finally spoke, the words came out in a tone that was neither harsh nor pitying but filled with absolute sincerity. "You don't owe me anything." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, not as a burden but as a gift, and she felt them echo in the quiet corners of her heart. She had lived too long expecting the world to demand something from her, for every kindness to come with a hidden cost. Yet here was a man who asked for nothing, who expected nothing, who offered warmth and shelter simply because it was the right thing to do. His words struck her so deeply that she almost didn't know how to breathe, stunned not only by his kindness but by the realization that decency still existed in a world that had shown her so little of it. The firelight flickered against the rough wooden walls. The storm raged on outside, and she sat wrapped in his blanket, clutching the coffee in both hands, overwhelmed by a sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she believed she could close her eyes without fear, not because she had bargained for safety, but because someone had given it freely, with nothing asked in return. That night she sat close to the fire, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and as the flames danced against the stone hearth, she felt the weight of her own exhaustion pressing down harder than ever before. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from a mixture of relief and disbelief, because never in her life had she expected such simple kindness from a stranger. For years, every door she had knocked on had come with conditions. Every gesture of help had hidden strings, and she had been taught that survival meant trading pieces of herself just to be allowed to exist. Yet here she was, sitting at the table of a man who had nothing to gain and still chose to give. The cowboy moved about the small ranch house with quiet purpose, checking the fire, setting bread on the table, and filling her cup again before sitting across from her with a calm ease that made the room feel safe. His presence wasn't intimidating, but grounding, like the steady weight of an oak tree in the middle of a storm. He spoke very little, and when he did, his words carried no judgment, only patience, as though he knew she needed silence more than conversation. As the wind howled outside and the rain hammered against the windows, she realized that for the first time in years she didn't feel like a burden, a problem to be solved, or a debt to be paid. She was simply a human being who had been given dignity without question. The thought unraveled her, and she pressed her hands to her face, crying harder, though this time her tears carried a strange lightness. Across the table, the cowboy let her cry without interruption, his eyes steady but kind, and when she looked up she saw no pity in them, only respect. It was then she understood what he had meant when he told her she didn't owe him anything. He wasn't offering her a favor that needed to be returned, and he wasn't rescuing her to make himself feel noble. He was simply living by a truth that seemed almost forgotten in the world she had come from. No one should ever have to bargain their worth for survival. The simplicity of that belief shook her more deeply than any act of charity ever had, because it reminded her of something she thought she had lost: the knowledge that compassion was real, that it still existed even in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes it lived in the quiet strength of people who asked for nothing in return. As the night stretched on, she stayed awake longer than she intended, not out of fear, but because she wanted to remember every second of this feeling, to hold on to the fragile proof that kindness was not dead. And when her eyes finally closed, it was with the peace of knowing that she had been given not just shelter, but the chance to believe in humanity again.